A very good morning to you. Things are seemingly off to a solid start for Sir Keir Starmer in Beijing as he attempts at something of a reset in relations with China. There were, relatively speaking, warm words between him and President Xi in their first meeting. It ended up running twice as long as expected.
As you'd probably expect, there was still a reference to, I think, we describe recent troubles in the relationship as well. President Xi pointed to what he called twists and turns that did not serve the interests of the two countries, so throwing a bit of shade there on the previous Conservative administration. Here's some of what Keir Starmer had to say.
We are G20 economies. We're fellow members of the United Nations Security Council, and our trading relationships support hundreds of thousands of jobs in each other's countries and have gone on for a very, very long history. China is a vital player on the global stage, and it's vital that we build a more sophisticated relationship.
Well, Beth and Helen Ann are there for us. Before we get to Helen Ann, let's listen to Beth Rigby's summary of all of the key moving parts.
So that meeting has now taken place between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Starmer, and what a moment that was. The first time in 8 years that a UK Prime Minister has visited Beijing, and it was a meeting that carried a lot of weight, controversy and obviously consequence. And I think both men met that moment in their opening remarks. We're yet to hear from the Prime Minister about how he felt it went, but at the top of that meeting, he said clearly to the Chinese leader that the UK wanted a more sophisticated relationship with China. He said it had been too long since a British Prime Minister had visited the country. He said of China, it is a vital player on the global stage, and it is vital we build a more sophisticated relationship. With a nod to people back home, the Prime Minister also said he made a promise 18 months ago, when we were elected into government, I would make Britain face outwards again, because as we all know, events abroad affect everything that happens back in our home countries, to prices on the supermarket shelves, to how secure we feel. So a Prime Minister thousands of miles away, still trying to make the point here in China about the cost of living, which will be his driving message through 2026. And as for President Xi, he made some fascinating remarks at the top of that bilateral meeting. He said that the UK-China relationship had taken some twists and turns in recent years that did not serve the interests of both countries, referring clearly there to the golden age, as it was put back in 2016 when President Xi came to the UK for a state visit, and David Cameron, then the Prime Minister, said that the two countries were entering a golden era. Well, subsequently, relationships got much more frosty, with the Conservative governments being much more circumspect about a relationship with China. Now, interestingly, at the top of that meeting, President Xi, referring, I think, to that obliquely, said that in the past, Labour governments made important contributions to the growth of China-UK relations, so some politics in all of that. And he also said, in a world as turbulent and fluid as the one we are living in, more dialogue between the UK and China was, to quote him, imperative, whether it was for the sake of world peace and stability or for our two countries' economies and people. He went on to say China stands ready to develop with the UK a long-term and consistent strategic partnership. And he said of the two leaders, President Xi said, they would stand the test of history if they could rise above differences. He noted that the visit had drawn a lot of attention, and he said, quoting a Chinese proverb, range far your eye over long distances, telling Starmer there really perhaps to ignore the noise and press on. So you couldn't really have had warmer words at the top of that meeting. But as we've been saying, there are challenges in this relationship too, and the Prime Minister is under pressure to raise human rights questions to the Chinese Premier, and also the matter of Ukraine and Russia, and whether or not he's asked President Xi to speak to President Putin. So it's not all plain sailing, but I think from the top of that bilateral meeting, these are two countries that clearly want to do business together, and that is why Keir Starmer's here.
Beth Rigby there for us. Helen Ann is able to join us live once again in Beijing. Helen Ann, very good morning to you. Good afternoon there. I guess, what is the framing on the Chinese side of that extended meeting?
Yeah, we've had the readouts from the Chinese side. It's worth saying that dissecting a Chinese readout is always a little bit of a game of reading between the lines, but it's given us a bit of an idea of some of the areas that were covered in the room. We haven't yet had official announcement about precise agreements, but this does give us a sense of what they spoke about. So on that all-important issue of trade and business interests and economic links that, of course, have been so important to Keir Starmer on this visit, there were clear areas that the Chinese said they hoped they'd be able to cooperate further on, particularly education, healthcare and financial services were the few that they pointed to. Remember, that's important because the UK's sale of services to China is really our biggest export and considered to be one of the most important sectors. The readout also said that they hoped there could be joint research in other sort of future important areas, areas like AI, biosciences, new energy and low carbon technology. Of course, remember that China is really the world leader in that sort of green technology. So lots of sense that there might be cooperation on those things. There was hints that some of the more difficult topics did come up in the room. Remember, this is a Chinese readout, so it's always sort of a little bit from the Chinese perspective. But they said that Taiwan came up, the self-governing island that China sees as its own. And the readout said that the UK stated clearly that it has not changed its official position on Taiwan. Remember, actually, the vast majority of countries in the world don't officially recognise Taiwan as a country, do not support Taiwan independence, and for China, the reiteration of that position is incredibly important. They also said that Hong Kong came up. Now, Prime Minister Starmer, ahead of this visit, said that he would raise the case of Jimmy Lai, one of Hong Kong's most infamous pro-democracy voices, who has been found guilty of national security offences in a trial that the UK sees as politically motivated. No mention of Jimmy Lai specifically in the readout, but it did say this, that the UK recognises that Hong Kong's prosperity and stability are in the interests of both countries. So that's China speak, really, I think, for the fact that that difficult topic probably did come up, but they weren't going into a huge amount of detail in the readouts. Other things that are kind of just worth saying is that there was a big and sort of chunky section where it spoke about the fact that they agreed that unilateralism, protectionism and power politics have ramped up. I wonder who they might be talking about there, because remember, from the Chinese perspective, the bigger global geopolitical picture is important here. And the idea that that the UK-US relationship has been on slightly streakier ground is an area the Chinese would like to gently push up around the edges on. So that is important for the Chinese to get out as well.
Helen Ann, thank you very much indeed, Helen Ann Smith, talking to us there. Mario, we're going to jump in because we're just hearing from Keir Starmer, who, of course, is in China meeting the president. Let's hear what he's got to say.
Yes, we had a very good, productive session with real concrete outcomes, and it was a real strengthening of the relationship, and that's in the national interest because, of course, there are huge opportunities here in China. It's the second biggest economy in the world, and that's why we've got such a big business delegation. A lot of the discussion was about how we open up access for those opportunities, focusing, as I always do, on how is this going to be delivered back in the United Kingdom, how does it benefit people back at home. And we made some really good progress on tariffs for whisky, on visa-free travel to China, and on information exchange and cooperation on irregular migration, focusing particularly on small boats and engine parts. So a very good constructive meeting with real outcomes, and that's very much in our national interest.
Yeah, tell us more about those concrete outcomes as you describe them, say on visa-free travel. What in specific terms have you agreed?
Well, we've agreed that on tariffs for whisky, we're looking at how they're to be reduced, what the time frame is, visa-free travel, how far, how much, and when that can start, and on the information exchange on small boats, the cooperation that we need, within a dialogue actually about greater strategic focus on security and defence. But for us it's very important on small boats that we get our arms around the engines that are being used in those small boats. So on all those three areas, but they're examples of a much wider opening of access for business that we discussed at great length in terms of the fact that after 8 years, This is the first visit by a Prime Minister, and we wanted to make sure that we've got that strategic approach on all of these issues.
President Xi's words and his tone seemed warm. What do you say to folk back home who might feel a bit squeamish about that?
Well, we did have a good meeting, and a long meeting as well. We had the formal parts, we had some informal parts, and then we continued over lunch. And so the relationship is in a good place, a strong place. And what I'd say to everybody here is that I always act in our national interest. And therefore the question for me is, how does this accelerate and deliver back at home? I know that whatever's going on in the world, the most important thing to the vast majority of people is the cost of living. So opening up access to business, opportunities, seizing those opportunities, which then gets reflected in better businesses, in jobs, in price reductions at home, really matter. And so we made real progress on all of those areas.
There are, though, big differences, significant differences between the UK and China in terms of outlook. How forcefully did you raise issues such as the jailing of the pro-democracy campaigner Jimmy Lai, the treatment of the Uyghurs, for instance?
Well, we raised those issues as you would expect. Part of the rationale for engagement is to make sure that we can both seize the opportunities that are available, which is what we've done, but also have a mature discussion about issues that we disagree on.
Were they listening on that, you think?
Yes, we did have a respectful discussion about that, raised those issues, as you would expect. But that, if you like, is part and parcel of the reason to engage. It is in our national interest, it gives us great opportunities, but it also gives us the opportunity to have those discussions about areas where we disagree.
A final question on a wider topic. President Trump has said a massive armada, as he described it, is moving quickly towards Iran and that time is running out. Is time running out? Do you think President Trump is acting in the appropriate way here?
Well, the big issue, the big challenge here is to ensure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear program, and we're all absolutely agreed on that, and we're working with allies to that end, and that is the central focus of what I'm doing with our allies.
And President Trump's actions the right ones?
Well, we all agree that ensuring that Iran doesn't get that nuclear program is a number one priority, and that's what we're working on.
Prime Minister, thank you.